Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne and I have concerns about the Welsh Government's RSE code that has been introduced for Welsh schools. When designing and delivering their RSE curriculum, schools must design it in a way that is inclusive, including being inclusive to pupils who identify as trans or queer.
So it has to be in a way that's inclusive, including LGBTQ plus inclusivity.
Of course, schools should teach children that everyone should be treated with respect, but schools should not normalise abnormal perceptions. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders version 4, created in 1994, the term gender identity was used to describe a diagnosable mental health condition of gender identity disorder. The term was a descriptive phrase, not a definitive one. It may very well have been called feeling I'm in the wrong body disorder. The manual states, for clinically referred children, onset of cross-gender interests and activities is usually between ages 2 and 4 years, and some parents report that their child has always had cross-gender interests. Only a very small number of children with gender identity disorder will continue to have symptoms that meet criteria for gender identity disorder in later adolescence or adulthood. Typically, children are referred around the time of school entry because of parental concern that what they regarded as a phase does not appear to be passing. Most children with gender identity disorder display less overt cross-gender behaviours with time, parental intervention or response from peers. By late adolescence or adulthood, about 3/4 of boys who had a childhood history of gender identity disorder report a homosexual or bisexual orientation, but without concurrent gender identity disorder. Most of the remainder report a heterosexual orientation, also without concurrent gender identity disorder. The corresponding percentages for sexual orientation in girls are not known. Some adolescents may develop a clearer cross-gender identification and request sex reassignment surgery, or may continue in a chronic course of gender confusion or dysphoria. In adult males, there are 2 different courses for the development of gender identity disorder. The first is a continuation of gender identity disorder that had an onset in childhood or early adolescence. These individuals typically present in late adolescence or adulthood. In the other course, the more overt signs of cross-gender identification appear later and more gradually, with a clinical presentation in early to mid-adulthood, usually following, but sometimes concurrent with, transvestic fetishism. Professor Emma Reynolds is an academic from Cardiff University. She's been hugely influenced by the queer theory of Judith Butler and has been responsible for developing the Welsh Government RSE code and educational resources to be used by teachers. One of those resources is Agenda, created for secondary school pupils in Wales. Agenda has been recommended for use in schools by Estyn, the Education and Training Inspectorate for Wales. In Agenda, it states, gender identity is used in this resource to refer to a person's inner sense of self. How is it that a term that was used to describe a diagnosable mental health condition is being taught to our school children as something that everyone has? There are 3 groups that benefit from this teaching. Number 1, queer theorists aim to undermine heteronormativity, the perception that to be normal, a boy must be masculine and sexually attracted to girls, and girls must be feminine and sexually attracted to boys. For them, pushing the idea that everyone has their own gender identity is a great tool to undermine social expectations of what it is to be a boy and what it is to be a girl. Number 2, trans activists. Trans activists would like society to accept their comfortable fiction rather than their less comfortable truth. For example, there should not be a stigma associated with transvestic fetishism. It says something interesting about male sexuality and would benefit from scientific research. Unfortunately, there is a stigma. It is far more socially acceptable for people to believe that you are born in the wrong body than to believe that you have or had a transvestic fetish. Number 3, the gender identity industry. There is a huge amount of money to be made in pushing this idea. There is money to be made in the pushing of this idea in the provision of training courses to organisations eager to flaunt their diversity and inclusion credentials. Estyn recommend local authorities and consortia should work with external partners to deliver relevant professional learning opportunities for staff in schools across primary and secondary sectors. There is also money to be made in the medicalisation of young bodies. In 2007, Boston Children's Hospital in the United States was the first in the country to offer gender-affirmative care for children, using puberty blockers to suppress the development of puberty. The person leading this new treatment was Dr. Norman SPACK, who treated Jack Green, son of longtime Mermaids CEO Susie Green. Susie Green is a great advocate for the use of puberty blockers. In an article, SPACK claimed, "You can get ahead of the game if you can shut puberty down altogether. If you stop puberty, you don't have to go through all of the external challenges. Halting puberty and its effects make it much easier for a child to transition into the gender that they identify as. No longer would they have to endure physical alterations that are more costly and possibly more traumatic. Puberty is a time in which sex-defining features begin to fully form. But if puberty is stopped, the patient can transition into a body defined by their gender, not their sex." Dr. Norman SPACK has left Boston Children's Hospital, but his legacy continues.
A child will often know that they are transgender from the moment that they have any ability to express themselves, and parents will often tell us this. We have parents who tell us that their kids, they knew from the minute they were born practically, and actions like refusing to get a haircut or standing to urinate, trying to stand to urinate, refusing to stand to urinate, trying on siblings' clothing, playing with the quote opposite gender toys, things like that.
Puberty blockers allow the possibility for boys to grow up to look like girls and girls to grow up to look like boys. As a money-making investment, it has fantastic potential. Puberty blockers alone can make drug companies a fortune.
If even 100 children took these drugs for 7 years, that's 27 million in drug sales. And that's just the puberty blockers.
However, there was a problem selling puberty blockers. A boy who exhibits feminine behavior is normal. It's not typical, but it's normal. A girl who exhibits masculine behavior is normal. It's not typical, but it's normal. Believing you're in the wrong body is not normal. We are our body. Gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder is very distressing. Many people who struggle with it will benefit from psychotherapeutic counselling to help them understand the factors that have given rise to those feelings. For some, transition may be the best option. The problem is counselling doesn't pay, not in the long term. If you can convince children who feel a bit different that they are really in the wrong body, you have someone committed to puberty blockers and surgery with a lifelong dependence on cross-sex hormones. That's a lifelong revenue pipeline. Before selling a product, you need to sell the idea. This is known as marketing. Puberty blockers are the product, gender identity is the idea, children are the target market. Marketing is the art of persuasion. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle has been credited with the earliest study of formal logic. Aristotle argued that there were 3 modes of rhetorical persuasion that appeal to 3 different parts of the mind. These are logos, an appeal to logic or reason, pathos, an appeal to the emotions, ethos, an appeal to authority. The gender unicorn is promoted in Professor Reynolds' resource Agenda. It is separately promoted in a video for Transform Cymru that was partly funded by the Welsh Government. The gender unicorn tells us that we all have a gender identity that is independent of our biological sex. Superficially, it sounds plausible until you start thinking about it. Not everyone is convinced by this idea.
Indicate quite clearly that you're to regard biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual proclivity as varying independently, which of course they don't. By any stretch of the imagination, they're so tightly correlated that, well, you can't use correlation to imply cause or to infer causality, but Jesus, when the correlations are above 0.95, you have to start wondering if there's actually not some causal link, and it's absurd to me that we really even have to have that discussion. But the notion, and this is being taught to school kids, this is mainstream doctrine, Joe. I mean, look up the gender unicorn. That's a fun thing to look up. I mean,
what is the gender unicorn?
The gender unicorn is this little happy symbol that's being marketed to children, in elementary school, describing to them the fact that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual proclivity vary independently. They're going after them very young. And so that's part of the school system now in many, many places.
So in many ways, it's sort of an indoctrination. They're trying to...
You might say that, yeah.
The gender unicorn.
The gender unicorn, man. Check that thing out.
Gender identity, female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, other genders, gender expression, feminine, masculine, other, sex assigned at birth, female, male, other, intersex. Ooh, like aliens. Physically attracted to men, women, other gender, S. Yes, emotionally attracted.
So what you do if you're a kid is you put a little marker there on the arrow to show where you're located on all those independent dimensions. And obviously, if you look at the style of the gender unicorn, you can tell what sort of age it's aimed at, because that looks like it's aimed for, certainly not aimed at kids over, I would say, 10.
Yeah, why does the gender unicorn have a double helix DNA symbol where its penis or vagina should be? That's
to indicate that there's no such thing as biology, I presume.
The gender unicorn is not science, it is marketing. The arguments of trans activists rely heavily on pathos. Scarcely a week goes by when we don't hear about trans people being among the most marginalised in society.
Trans community are amongst, the most marginalised and abused communities.
But trans people are amongst the most stigmatised minorities in our society.
Trans people are some of the most discriminated against in our society today.
Trans women are more vulnerable than other women.
Trans people who also are amongst some of the most discriminated against people in this country.
Huge health problems, high suicide rate, and I think everybody ought to worry about that.
There's been an increase in rape of trans women. They are a vulnerable group of people.
About 1 out of 4 trans teenagers try and kill themselves.
The mental health implications of this debate and what it's doing to this community is really worrying. There are now members of this community actively looking to leave this country because they no longer feel safe.
Today, as we mark Transgender Day of Remembrance, we honour the memory of everyone who has tragically been killed because of who they are.
On page 152 of the agenda resource, it states, Transgender Day of Remembrance is on the 20th November every year. This year, the Welsh Government tweeted their respect for the fallen. Today, we remember the trans individuals who have lived, loved, fought and fallen. We remember their spirit and their message that everyone deserves the right to be exactly who they are. The last trans person in the UK to be murdered was Amy Griffiths, a trans woman murdered in her flat in Droitwich Spa in 2019. The killer, Martin Sapieri, was on the run for stabbing a woman in the neck outside a supermarket near his home in Wallington, Surrey, 3 days earlier. The judge said that there was no suggestion that this was a murder aggravated by hostility towards the deceased because of her transgender identity. Amy Griffiths' murder was a tragedy. But since her murder in the UK, there have been 4 murders committed by trans-identified or cross-dressing males. The Welsh Government's tweet is not inclusivity. It's marketing. GATE, Global Action for Trans Equality, is a highly influential, though small, trans lobby group. Between 2011 and 2013, it was the best funded trans organisation in the world. In the About page of the 2011 website, the organisation states its aims. Both the World Health Organization, WHO, and the American Psychiatric Association, APA, are reviewing the International Code of Diseases, ICD, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, which gives activists a unique opportunity to lobby for changes of the current mental health pathologization of trans identities. In ICD version 10, there is a section named Disorders of Sexual Preference. Within that section, there is an entry with code F651, Fetishistic Transvestism. The wearing of clothes of the opposite sex, principally to obtain sexual excitement and to create the appearance of a person of the opposite sex. Fetishistic transvestism is distinguished from transsexual transvestism by its clear association with sexual arousal and the strong desire to remove the clothing once orgasm occurs and sexual arousal declines. It can occur as an earlier phase in the development of transsexualism. There is also a section named Gender Identity Disorders. There is also an entry for Gender Identity Disorder of Childhood, where it states, a disorder usually first manifests during early childhood and always well before puberty, characterized by a persistent and intense distress about assigned sex, together with a desire to be, or insistence that one is, of the other sex. There is persistent preoccupation with the dress and activities of the opposite sex, and repudiation of the individual's own sex. The diagnosis requires a profound disturbance of the normal gender identity. Mere tomboyishness in girls or girlish behaviour in boys is not sufficient. A report documenting a meeting in The Hague in 2011 between GATE representatives and WHO officials is on the GATE website. The introduction to the document states, the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, is a document listing and classifying all disorders, diseases, injuries, and other health-related situations, as well as the diagnoses acknowledged and applied by health professionals and systems. The ICD is developed by the World Health Organization and adopted by the World Health Assembly. Its 10th edition, known as ICD-10, which was adopted in 1990, is currently in force. The WHO is currently reviewing the classification with an aim to introduce its 11th revision, ICD-11, in 2015. The current ICD-10 includes different diagnoses concerning trans persons, listed under Chapter 4, Mental and Behavioural Disorders. The references are included in the subchapters, Gender Identity Disorders and Disorders of Sexual Preference. These diagnoses are not only regularly applied to adult trans persons, but also to children and adolescents. In some countries, ICD-10 diagnoses are used to make trans persons access to health, including transitional health, possible, while in other countries the same codes are used for the opposite fact, denial of healthcare. There are also requirements to access legal recognition of gender identities in most countries where legal recognition of trans people's identities is possible. However, those same diagnoses have been criticised by trans people because they pathologise trans persons and their bodies, identities, expressions and sexual experiences. At the same time, and as they constitute outdated and biased judgments, the diagnoses concerning trans health issues have been criticised for their scarce or null clinical relevance. This is why different sectors of the trans community have been insisting on the need for a critical approach, both to applying ICD-10 and of developing ICD-11. In the Principles section of the document, it states, "The experts' meeting was guided by the following general principles proposed by Gate. 1. Gender variance is a common human feature. Therefore, gender identities and gender expressions are not pathologies. They must be respected, not treated, cured, suppressed, persecuted, and or punished." This is a logical fallacy known as a propositional fallacy. Gender variance is a common human feature. However, that does not mean that gender identities are not pathologies. The gender-critical argument that has been advanced in criticism of gender identity ideology is this: biological sex is immutable, gender is socially constructed, neither men nor women should feel constrained by socially imposed gender expectations. Being gender-critical means being critical of gender. Queer theory advocates and gender-critical advocates see the world in completely different ways. For gender-critical advocates, men and women are natural facts and not political categories, so it is not normal to believe that you were born in the wrong body. Astonishingly, the document contains arguments that come straight out of queer theory. They subvert language to change people's perspectives. In a section of the document, it states self-identification in a gender different than the sex assigned at birth and the experiences associated with that self-identification do not constitute a mental disorder. The gender-critical argument to this is sex is not assigned at birth, it is determined at conception. The sex you are should not determine the social role you play. If the feeling that you are not the sex you wish to be causes significant distress, this is a mental disorder. The association between gender diversity and pathology, in this case a mental disorder, is based on cultural prejudices and investment in the gender binary and its hierarchies. The gender-critical argument to this is, we reject gender binaries, but believing you were born in the wrong body is a mental disorder. There is nothing intrinsically disordered in identifying oneself in a different gender than the sex assigned at birth, adopting a gender expression contrary to cultural expectations associated with that assigned gender, or desiring to modify sex characteristics and demand social and legal recognition. The gender-critical argument to this is, it is true that there's nothing intrinsically disordered in adopting a gender expression contrary to cultural expectations associated with that assigned gender. However, the desire to modify sex characteristics does indicate a mental disorder. Trans people do have social and legal recognition. This recognition does not extend to accepting them as the sex they wish to be in all situations. The experts reached an agreement. The latest version of the ICD, ICD-11, was adopted by the 72nd World Health Assembly in 2019 and came into effect on 1st January 2022. Fetishistic transvestism has been removed completely from the ICD, and the section on gender identity disorders was removed from its position under the section Mental and Behavioural Disorders. A new subsection was created under the section Conditions Related to Sexual Health. It was entitled Gender Incongruence of Adolescence or Adulthood. This is not effective disease classification, it is marketing. On the basis of this change, Dr. Sophie Quinney, Clinical Director at Wales's only gender service, had this written on the NHS Wales website for all healthcare professionals in Wales. Being trans is not a mental illness, it is an integral part of being human. In the latest edition of the WHO International Compendium of Diseases, ICD-11, the diagnostic term HA 60.0, gender incongruence, replaces F64, transsexualism, ICD-10, and has been moved out of the chapter on mental and behavioural disorders. This has been welcomed by those campaigning for destigmatisation. For those who believe that men and women are natural facts and not political categories, gender identity disorder, otherwise known as gender dysphoria, otherwise known as gender incongruence, is a mental illness. Dr. Sophie Quinney is a member of the Welsh Government's highly influential LGBTQ+ expert panel. In July 2021, Gate published a document entitled Trans Rights are Human Rights, Dismantling Misconceptions about Gender, Gender Identity and the Human Rights of Trans People. The document included a criticism of the work of Dr. Lisa Littman, who coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. The criticism is not valid. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is an observation. It is not a theory. Gate is an extreme trans activist organisation lavishly funded by billionaires. The Greek philosopher Aristotle was aware of the power of the 3 modes of persuasion. It is a powerful marketing technique. Through the use of logos, the gender unicorn, Pathos, the trans day of remembrance, and Ethos, the depathologization of fetishistic transvestism, people have been persuaded that there is such an entity as a gender identity, which everybody has. There is zero scientific evidence to corroborate this belief. There is a common link between these 3 modes of persuasion. Trans Student Educational Resources, who produced the Gender Unicorn, have partnered with Arcus Foundation, who fund frontline trans activists. Transgender Europe support Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide, a research initiative that initiated the Trans Murder Monitoring Project. The project records reports of murders of trans people worldwide, and the reports it produces are used in the Trans Day of Remembrance. Arcus Foundation donated over $500,000 to Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide, covering a 4-year period. A global partner of Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide is Gate. Gate have successfully lobbied the World Health Organization to depathologize gender dysphoria. Arcus Foundation have contributed $1,100,000 directly and another $350,000 indirectly to Gate between 2009 and 2022. In the summer of 2014, Ruth Hunt from Cardiff was named Chief Executive of Stonewall, the LGBT rights charity. The previous March, same-sex marriage was legalised in England and Wales. The legal rights of LGBT people in the UK had been secured. But there were still salaries to pay and pension contributions to be made. In an online conversation held in September 2020, Hunt was asked, "Did you know it would be hard for Stonewall to take on the issue of trans rights?" Hunt responded that Stonewall had been under significant pressure from individual donors, stakeholders, campaigners, the organisations and the companies they worked with, who were all baffled why Stonewall would not consider trans issues. One of those organisations was Arcus Foundation. In 2014, at the very start of a time in charge, Stonewall received $42,000 from Arcus Foundation for 10 months of funding for the Rainbow Laces campaign to tackle homophobia in sports. In 2015, Arcus Foundation awarded Stonewall a further grant of $100,000 for 2 years of support to ensure full, legal and social equality for trans people by integrating trans-specific work into all key campaigning and programs. In an interview with BuzzFeed magazine, it was revealed that in college, Hunt studied Judith Butler. She knew the power of language. In 2016, Stonewall published a glossary on their website with new words and new definitions of existing words. The glossary is for a political purpose, and the definition of the words change when Stonewall find it politically expedient to change them. The glossary is made available to all of Stonewall's diversity champions. The glossary reinforces the lie that we all have a gender identity. We can speculate on how much Arcus Foundation influenced Stonewall's trans policy. But this much we do know. The founder and head of Arcus Foundation is the billionaire philanthropist John Stryker. In an interview, Stryker explained a precondition of being awarded a grant. We also required that all grantees have a board-approved non-discrimination policy that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. We believe it's critical for all our grantees to show an organisational dedication to LGBT rights, officially and in writing. To this day, non-discrimination remains an eligibility requirement for all grantees. It seems that in the very early stages of her leadership, Hunt was in discussion with representatives of Arcus Foundation. And the grants that Arcus awarded to Stonewall came with the precondition that there should be no discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, as if these two facets of human experience shared the exact same set of ethical concerns. They don't. This is marketing. Protection against discrimination on the basis of gender identity is not UK law. But the policy mandated by Arcus Foundation is the same policy that Stonewall is pushing to all the organisations that have signed up to its Diversity Champions programme and Workplace Equality Index. An organisation's ranking in the Stonewall Best Employer list is entirely dependent on how well it implements Stonewall guidance. The Welsh Government have very close links with Stonewall. From 2015 to 2021, they paid Stonewall £887,279 of taxpayers' money, more than any other organisation except the UK government. In line with Stryker's mandate, but not UK law, the Welsh Government have mandated that there should be no discrimination in the organisation on the basis of gender identity. When that decision was made, the Welsh Government were ideologically captured. They believed that the characteristics of sexual orientation and gender identity share the exact same set of ethical concerns. That is why it is mandatory for schools to teach gender identity to school pupils. John Stryker is a billionaire heir to a multi-billion-dollar medical corporation. Puberty blockers are the product. Gender identity is the idea. Welsh school children are the target market.